What is the most prestigious group you've ever been a part of? Let's talk about it. So lately, I've been really intentional about asking Christians this question. What does a person have to do to be saved? And almost everybody I've asked has said, believe. That's what you have to do to be saved. Believe. But I have a really hard time with that answer. And I'm not blaming anybody for answering it that way. It's the way we've been taught. It's been the go-to answer for Christians for centuries. The problem is, I think that answer is misleading. It is biblical, but it's incomplete. The passage that is quoted most often when we hear people talk about how belief is some kind of litmus test for salvation is a passage we find in Acts chapter 16. And we talked about that passage on Sunday, and it's all about this time when Paul and Silas told the jailer that all he had to do to be saved was believe. But if we quote that passage that was written to him, we're actually taking that passage out of context. So what if we did the same thing that we do with that passage, applying it to ourselves? What if we did that same thing with the passage in Luke 18, where Jesus told the man that he had to sell everything he has before he could follow Jesus? That story went like this, Luke 18. Once a religious leader asked Jesus this question, "Good teacher, what should I do to inherit eternal life?" This is the salvation question. So the context here is very important. This is a guy who knew all about religion, and he was looking for the answer to the who's in, who's out question. But that's the wrong question. He wanted to know, what is the minimum amount that I can do to be saved? And that was different than the motivation of the jailer. The jailer, when he asked Paul and Silas, was asking from a place of gratitude. The jailer saw something in Paul and Silas that he was drawn to, and not the religious leader. That's not what he was asking. In verse 20, Jesus said to him, "You know the commandments. You must not commit adultery. You must not murder. You must not steal. You must not testify falsely or lie. Honor your father and mother." And Jesus did this often on earth. He used the law to show people that they could never be good enough to be saved. And then this man replied, "I've obeyed all these commands since I was young." So what is this guy doing here? He's comparing himself to everyone else. Jesus says, "Don't lie." And this religious guy says, "I don't lie." "Oh, really, religious guy?" Jesus said, "Obey your parents." This guy says, "I do obey my parents." His response should have been, "I try my best," or "I try, but I fail sometimes. I fall short." Then Jesus probably would have given him this answer. He probably would have said, "Okay, believe in me and you'll be saved," if that's what the religious guy said. But that's not what he said. But because he's the religious leader and he answers this question from this place of pride, he answers from this place of self-righteousness, he reveals something about his motivations. Verse 22, when Jesus heard this answer, he said, "There is still one thing you haven't done. Sell all your possessions and give the money to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come follow me." So what if we took this sentence and we applied it as if this was written to us? And that this is a statement about how we are to be saved. Go and sell everything you have. That's what we do with the statement that Paul gave to the jailer. It was contextualized, so we can't apply it to us. If we applied this passage like we apply the passage in Acts, we'd be telling everybody that they have to sell everything they have to be saved. But we don't say that. Why? Because that's so obviously contradictory to what Jesus told other people that they had to do to be saved. Jesus knew that just believing wasn't going to be enough for this guy who had these self-righteous answers because his motivations were wrong. So one of my goals for this series is that we can adjust our language when we tell people how to be saved. Instead of taking the Acts passage out of context, what if we point to Jesus? That's our primary objective in telling people how to be saved. point to Jesus. It's all about him. Follow Jesus. So stop here, answer the first two questions, and then push play. So these two stories, the story of the jailer and the story of the religious leader, make me like the phrase faith in Jesus more than I like the word believe. When we tell people all they need to do to be saved is believe, we have to add a bunch of clarifiers. We have to clarify who are we believing in. We have to clarify what we do with that belief. We have to clarify what we're talking about in terms of belief in, like existence, or belief on, like faith. But when we just say faith in Jesus, we're clarifying all of that. We're clarifying that people have a relationship with Jesus in order to be saved. When you say that you have faith in Jesus, you're saying that you believe in Jesus, that he exists. You're saying that you trust in him, that you follow him, and you're describing which God we're talking about. Faith in Jesus. Because every religion has a God or something that it worships. The Islamic people say that belief in God saves them. They say that as well, but obviously it's very different. Their God is not the same God as our God. That's why we say Jesus. Their belief also requires a bunch of actions to convince God to accept their belief. Our faith is different than that. Faith in Jesus gives us access to the free gift of God's grace. So let's look at a few more passages that describe how a person is saved so we can get our language correct. Mark 16:16 says, anyone who believes and is baptized will be saved, but anyone who refuses to believe will be condemned. In this case, belief leads to following Christ as evidenced by baptism. Belief leads to following. That's what we do to be saved. Romans 10:9 says, if you openly declare that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, then you will be saved. This is a description of belief that leads to following, just like the one before. And what does that following look like? In this case, it's declaring that God is who he said he is. And then there's the most famous verse of all, John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. So this one can get me in trouble. Because just like that first verse with the jailer, if you take this one out of context, it looks like we're saying all you have to do is believe. But do you know who said this? And do you know who he said it to? It's one of the most famous sentences in the Bible. Do you know who it was said to? Well, let's read the first verse in this section. John 3, verse 1 says, there was a man named Nicodemus, a Jewish religious leader who was a Pharisee. So again, we have a story of Jesus talking to a religious leader. But this guy has a much different motivation for asking the question that he asks. Verse 2 says, after dark one evening, he came to speak with Jesus. Rabbi, he said, we all know that God has sent you to teach us. Your miraculous signs are evidence that God is with you. Nicodemus says, God has sent you to teach us. Your miraculous signs are evidence that God is with you. In other words, Jesus knew the motivation of the man asking the question. Jesus knew the belief of Nicodemus would lead him to follow Jesus, not to fight him. So let's turn a corner now and look at a verse that uses the word faith instead of believe to describe how a person is saved. They're very similar ideas, just with slightly different words. And my favorite example of this is Ephesians 2:8 and 9. I'm going to use the New International Version here because I really don't like how the New Living Translation puts the word believe in places that it just doesn't seem to belong. So here we go. Ephesians 2:8 and 9. For it is by grace that you have been saved. How? Through faith. And this is not from yourselves. It is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast. This shows that you are saved by God's grace. It's all Him doing it because you had faith. And that faith is belief that led you to follow Jesus. Belief that led you to follow. That's faith. So pause here, answer the last two questions, and I'll see you Sunday in church.